Okay, this is the commencement of an oral history program for the Ashfield and District Historical Society. Today we are interviewing Chris Pratten. And thanks for your time, Chris, today.
Pleasure.
So, Chris, you were the Secretary of the Ashfield and District Historical Society from the years 1993 to 2001.
That's correct.
Now, let's start from your early years. Where and when were you born, Chris?
Well, I was born in St Luke's Hospital, Darlinghurst, in 1934.
And since the 1950s, you were a grazier and farmer.
That's correct too.
On a property near Orange. Can you tell me about that period of your life?
Oh, we'd need more tape capacity than I think you'd have to talk about that, because that was the major part of my life after I left uni, and I finally ended up with half the family property, some 20 kilometres west of Orange, and spent a stimulating time there being an owner occupier, so I could take time off to go to TAFE to lecture in horticulture and hone my skills in things not pertaining to the property. So that was good, being your own boss.
So I understand you had grown up in Sydney and went to school in Sydney, but making the transition to the bush, was that difficult?
Not really, because we owned the property all through my childhood, and that meant that every school holidays, instead of going to different holiday destinations as most people did, every school holidays went to the farm. Mm-hmm. So it was just an extension of that school holiday period into your working life.
And what grazing did you do? What sort of farming did you do?
Everything. I've even grown peas and potatoes once or twice. So basically everything. Initially it was sheep, a so-called dual-purpose breed of sheep, which I thought were useless, and that later led me to arguments with my brother and father about running the property, and we grew wheat. We had a few cattle, and I eventually ended up with nothing but cattle on my own property. So I've done everything. I've sat on the back of a plough dropping seed potatoes into the furrow and breaking every present-day occupational therapy law in doing so, but that's the way we planted them back in the 1950s.
Good. So by 1974, you established the Orangefield Naturalist and Conservation Society.
That's correct.
And you were its president. How did that come about?
Because I was concerned, together with a few friends, about developments on the Central Tablelands and the proposed Orange Bathurst new city, the proposed impact of that on natural values on the Central Tablelands. So 7 of us, I think it was, got together after church one morning it was, so that was a very good start, I thought. Most of the members at that initial meeting, or they all became foundation members, they were mostly members of the congregation of the church where I worshipped, and we elected ourselves into the various offices, and then we took that to a public meeting, which was crowded with people actually, and we did that because there was a certain push in the town by naturopaths, and the people were mixing up what a field naturalist group was and a naturopath type organisation, and we were tipped off that the naturopaths were going to take over this new group. So we therefore elected ourselves into position, and I got the presidency on that basis and held it for 10 years until I came to Sydney.
So it was about conservation?
Yes.
Natural conservation?
Watching the birds and the bees, and trying to protect lands. We did national park proposals over some rough land just west of Orange, and that was taken up by the National Parks Association later on, and it's now National Park, and so we achieved quite a lot, really.
Mm. So in 1984, you ultimately accepted a paid role with the National Trust of Australia, and you moved to Sydney.
That's correct too.
So tell me about your time.
Everything's correct. How are you getting everything correct?
That's good. So tell me about your time with the National Trust.
Oh, well, again, that would take a book, because I was there, even though I was only there for 5 years, I was in charge, and I was the first person to be in charge of what was then named the Environment Section, and that was all the practical work carried out by the Trust in conservation lobbying, not on its own properties. We had nothing to do with the Trust properties, but all the work done with all the councils right across the state, and particularly with Sydney City Council, and with the various government departments, national parks of course, and also the new Heritage Office, because the Heritage Act had come in, I think it was 1977, and this was in 1984, so we had a lot to do with them, of course.
Mm. Now, what has been your approach to balancing heritage values with living practically? So how does one find the balance between conservation and use?
Oh, well, by establishing what's significant about a place, and whether it's this house, and I went through that exercise with this house before I put that bay window on there, for example, establishing what's significant about a place, be it a national park or be it a house or building in the city. And then when you know what is significant about a place, you'll know if you've got any conservation philosophy and a modicum of common sense, you'll know what can be tampered with, if I can use that expression, and what should stay in its original or natural state.
Mm. So you mentioned this house. So we're recording this interview today in your house in Summerhill. Tell us, when did you move to this house?
Well, in 1985, I had been working at the Trust for a year or so and staying with a friend up in Croydon, and I had been staying with him for some years every couple of weeks as I came to Sydney working for the Nature Conservation Council, which we haven't mentioned, and that's another recording session. But every weekend for 5 or 6 years before I bought this house in 1983, I visited every open house of interest between Croydon and Newtown, looking for an old home to buy, to restore, and that was before I had even heard of the National Trust job. So it was fortuitous that I was looking for a house to restore before I accepted a position with the National Trust.
Mm-hmm.
But the two gelled very neatly together.
Okay, so you found this house in Summerhill after an extensive search, by the sound.
Correct. Yeah, very extensive. It was one of the last unrestored houses in the inner west, and I think you might have got another one of the unrestored houses, because I remember looking at the outside of your house, which wasn't then on the market, and thinking that looked as though it was a house that may suit me. And in fact, did I look at it? I think I did look at it, but whether it was on the market, must have been, I suppose. But I very nearly bought a house over in the boulevard at Lewisham, a double-fronted Victorian house. But no, this one came on the market, and I used to park outside at 10 p.m. at night, counting the cars in Prospect Road, and at midnight counting the cars at midnight, and there was actually one every minute at midnight and two every minute at 10 p.m. in those days, in 1983. I hate to think what the figure would be now. But apart from the traffic, which is terrible here, and getting worse, and people are driving faster despite speed humps, apart from the traffic, I've been very happy. Oh, and the traffic above, of course.
Mm. So heritage was clearly one of the areas that was of interest.
Yes.
Was there any other reasons why you chose to live in Summerhill?
I wanted to be within walking distance of a railway station, because even though the job with the National Trust wasn't on the horizon when I bought the house, I knew my life on the farm was coming to an end. I knew my marriage was coming to an end, and that I would end up probably in the city working, so I wanted to be within walking distance of the railway station.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So what was the Ashfield area like in those days? You mentioned 1983 was when you moved here. Can you describe the Ashfield district in those days?
Well, we're lucky, really, because even though we get upset, well, I get upset every time I see a new block of apartments going up, we're still blessed with basically two-storey and single-storey residences in our suburbs in the Ashfield municipality, which has just been scrapped by Mr. Mike Baird, and I hope he suffers in his bed at night, agonising over that act, because it certainly had a big impact on those people such as myself who value the history of Ashfield municipality, as well as the representation that we've had with that intense area that has been a council since 1872, but I mustn't digress into present-day politics, must I? What was Ashfield like? It was not that much different to what it was today. Summerhill was not nearly as busy. The big issue at Summerhill was a proposal to build a 7-storey building on the council car park at the supermarket. That was the big issue in Summerhill, and 2 of the 3 East Ward councillors, in clear breach of the provisions of the Local Government Act, were voting in favour of this at council meeting when the Local Government Act said that they shouldn't participate in the debate even, let alone vote, because they had a conflict of interest. They owned properties in the business centre of Summerhill, and they were trying to alter the zoning to permit this 7-storey building to go up. Well, fortunately, I had not long made acquaintance with the director of the Department of Environment and Planning, and I invited him to come out to Summerhill and look at the car park. And so one Saturday there was a bit of a sensation, as far as sensations go in Summerhill, when I was seen showing this gentleman, Dick Smythe was his name, showing him round Summerhill and pointing out how inappropriate many of us thought, and I think Bernadette was probably in the Summerhill Action Group as well. That's what it was called. SHAG was its acronym. My word lectionary is disappearing with every month I stay on the planet. So that was the big issue in Summerhill, but fortunately that didn't go ahead. The council didn't rezone it, I don't think. Anyhow, the proposal didn't go ahead, and I'm sure we're the better off for it now, because Summerhill the car park is full on Sunday morning by 9 o'clock, a reflection of the fact that whereas there were 2 or 3 businesses doing well in 1984, there are now 20 or 30 doing well. So that's the biggest change, really, I think, that's happened down in the Summerhill business area. But we have to fight still to prevent inappropriate development going in the residential areas. I'm just fighting a personal battle starting yesterday to see a new development down at the bottom of Queen Street named The Pratten, and I've accosted the foreman and said that I want 7.5% commission on their sales for using the family name without my approval, and I think that's fair enough.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned the Summerhill Action Group. Can you tell me more about them and your involvement?
Well, apart from my connection with the National Trust and the fact that I was known to people in power in the planning world, I wasn't a rampant member. There was a committee. We held meetings. I can remember Ray Jones, who was a later mayor of Ashfield. He was very prominent in it. Paul Cassidy, who now lives up the mountains, he was prominent. Margaret Davis, she was very prominent. And Susan Thompson, she was a planner and her professional knowledge was of value. But I can't remember many of the other members. on the committee, actually. See, that's getting a few years ago now. But
And do you remember the Summerhill Solstice Festival and how that got
well,
arranged?
yes, Margaret Davis was the driving force there. That I think was a legitimate, I was going to say illegitimate, but I think it was a legitimate offspring from the Summerhill Action Group. That was one thing they did to try and promote the cohesiveness of the little shopping centre down there, and that was a great success, and the Historical Society ran a very profitable stand there every year, and it was a great shame when people ran out of steam and the insurance premiums got so great that the idea fell into disuse or abeyance.
And the Summerhill Chamber of Commerce, did you come across them?
I should have got my medal. I have been awarded a medal from the Summerhill Chamber of Commerce, which is big enough, never mind gold medals at Rio. This is a thing that would protect the whole of my breastplate. And I've still got it somewhere in some drawer. I was awarded, and it's engraved, and I was presented it at a dinner somewhere. But that's about all I can remember of the Summerhill Chamber of Commerce.
What were you awarded for?
I don't know. Being a good bloke, yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris. I want to ask you now about the Ashfield and District Historical Society. When did you first join?
Well, strange to say, I joined the ADHS when I was still living in Orange, because I'd heard about it, and I must have gone to a meeting on one of the times I was in the city working for the Conservation Council, and I met Nora and Ina Harper and Gwen Gardner and the core of people that ran it week by week, and I was impressed with the collection that Nora Peake essentially had put together of material that she'd gathered in every source imaginable, and it was up in the little room in Norton Street where we then were, and I was impressed with that, so I joined, and I came to one or two meetings when I was in the city, but then I was a member of, I suppose, 10 years standing, probably, by the time I moved to Summerhill in 1985.
So in 93 you became secretary of the Historical
Swept
Society.
into power,
Yeah.
Mark.
Tell us about that time.
Well, I don't want to get onto personalities, but there were personalities in the society, or a personality, that, in the opinion of myself and some of my friends, was slowly choking the small organisation as it then was. And so I discussed the matter with a few of these recalcitrant members who held my views, and we decided to rid ourselves of this pesky beast. That's what you did on the farm. If you had a steer that wouldn't behave and went for you, or did nasty things in the yard, you got rid of it. Anyhow, at an annual meeting, I made sure that I had enough supporters on my side of the room. I think there was only about 13 or 14 there altogether, so I didn't have to have that many. It was easy to count the numbers, and we had an election and put in a new president, and my part of the deal was I agreed to be the secretary, so I was swept into power under those conditions. And that was the beginning of the saving of the Ashfield Districts Historical Society. And I'm saying that, but that's the truth.
And who was the president?
The new president was Doug Benson.
And you had a relationship with Doug for some
Yes,
time?
yes, had known Doug for years.
So you worked hard to drive up the membership.
That's correct. Yeah.
So you said it was a small organisation, but
Yes.
you worked hard to increase the members. Tell me about what motivated you to do that.
Oh, well, motivation was that if the membership grew, the organisation would be more successful and more financially stable, and we would hopefully have more people to do things. It didn't quite turn out like that because it just really meant that those that did things in the small group had to do 5 times more in the larger group, because voluntary groups being such as they are, you don't really have a flood of people that say, oh, I'll do that. It's usually, will you do it? Maybe. But the membership grew from about 60 or 70 financial members to 250 over the next few years, and that meant that whereas we were struggling to have evening meetings, when we got the membership up, when you had an evening meeting, the little room would be packed.
What sort of things did you use to increase the membership?
Well, mainly increasing the standard of the annual publication, which was rather pompously called a journal, and eventually I got my colleagues to agree to change that name because I thought it was a bit off-putting to people in this day and age. So to increase the quality of that, and to particularly increase the frequency of house inspection. Everyone loves going to look at an old house that someone else has had to work on and sticky beak at how someone else lives. And they were very popular, house inspections, and increase through my contacts in the heritage field in the city and at the National Trust, to increase the quality of the speakers, getting architects and planners and bureaucrats, anyone who had some field of interest that a local historical society would be able to gel with. I asked them if they'd come and talk to us, and sure enough, most people would say yes. We even had the editor of the Macquarie Dictionary one night. I don't know how that got through the net, but that was a successful meeting.
And Chris, at this time you commenced consulting as a heritage consultant around this time.
That's right. In mostly in collaboration with Bob Irving, an eminent architectural historian, and he and I worked together for 10 years.
Tell us about that period of your life. What was that like for you? Was it a productive time, an enjoyable time?
Oh, it was productive. We did a lot of reports on a variety of sites, from historic houses, particularly out in the southwestern suburbs around Campbelltown, and churches and mine sites and other industrial sites. The large North Sydney Gasworks was one such site. It was very rewarding and productive, but most people didn't want to hear what honest heritage consultants said. Now, I'm not saying that most heritage consultants are dishonest, but most heritage consultants try to do a report that their client will want. We tried to do a report that the site wanted, and therefore we got a bit disappointed that the Heritage Branch, for instance, was more interested in the formula that we used rather than what we said, and little things like that. And eventually I got a bit sick of doing reports that had to go to the bureaucrats, because that was usually one of the organisations that either commissioned a report on a brickworks or a building, and to find that the bureaucrats in that organisation were people who didn't want to do anything was not the way a farmer. You know, every time a farmer gets up in the morning, he's got to do something that day, and it's got to be done. It wasn't a good background, really, for my work in heritage and conservation.
Nevertheless, that experience and knowledge that you, and that professional understanding that you had with heritage, you brought that to your capabilities in your role as Secretary of the Historical Society, and you often spoke at Ashfield Council meetings in the defence of heritage matters. Was Ashfield Council receptive to your ideas in those days?
No, not initially. In fact, the long-serving mayor of the time said publicly that he was going to nail me to the wall of the council building next time I was there. So when I heard that, it was said, not in my presence, of course, at a meeting that I wasn't at, but when I was told about it, the next meeting I sat up in the front row. But I wasn't nailed to the wall. I'm still here talking to you today. But it was a very stressful time for me, because I suppose for 10 years I appeared every meeting or second meeting advocating a course of action that the owner of a building didn't want, or that the council didn't want to impose on an owner of the building. And so that when you didn't have a majority of supporters on the council, that was like bashing your head against a brick wall. But slowly the composition of the council changed until such a time as we had a council that was narrowly in favour of protecting local heritage, and so that made a huge difference. But then the state government changed, and all the lists of heritage buildings throughout the municipality that Bob Irving had prepared as a consultant to the council. I didn't seek to work with him because I thought that was a conflict of interest for me. but he did very professional work, and none of those lists were put into law because the state government wasn't in favour of it at the time. So they called in a Melbourne consultant to review what Bob Irving had done, and I was furious at hearing that, even though by that time I was quite ill. But I was delighted to hear the other day that the council staff here in Ashfield objected so much to the idea of a Melbourne consultant reviewing Bob's work that it was all thrown out. So what's going to happen now, I don't know.
There were times clearly when you were advocating heritage and conservation matters, and you were a lone voice in the Ashfield space. What kept you going, particularly when you're taking a public stance, and you spoke up in the face of opposition? What drove you on at those difficult times?
Stupidity, but nothing more than a strong belief in the need to protect the character of our urban areas, just in the same way as with the Nature Conservation Council. I'd eventually been elected chairman of that organisation, and the role there was to advocate the protection of natural landscapes. Now I was turning my attention to the built-up areas of the city, and I had my eyes opened by visiting Britain and even Russia, where I found the communist regime had not bulldozed all the Tsar's palaces, but turned them into museums. And yet here we were knocking down our little Tsar's palaces in Ashfield, right, left and centre.
Well, good, Chris. You co-authored many articles that have been published by the Historical Society. You wrote a lot of articles, but you co-authored a number with Nora Peake, I've noticed. What was your working relationship with Nora?
Dear Nora is now in the Never Never, so I can say what I like about her. But initially it was very difficult because she was a self-contained woman that had battled on virtually on her own for so many years, and here was I with my critical mind questioning things that she just knew backwards and I hadn't the faintest idea. But I worked professionally on the first Ashfield Heritage Study in 1992-1993, and Nora was retained by the firm I worked for, Godden Mackay, to do historical research on every site that we identified as being a heritage item. And so Bob Irving and I had the benefit of Nora's immense knowledge to do just a few words about the history of the ownership of properties before the present. And that was a huge benefit to being able to establish whether or not a property was significant or not, knowing the precise details of its history and the previous land use. And from that time on, we seem to establish a better working relationship, Nora and I, and then all the articles I wrote from that time on for the Society, Nora invariably supported me doing them, gave me information on land title movements, and even the book that I've recently completed on my grandfather, even though Nora wasn't there to see it launched a month or two ago, she helped me with that, going back 20 years or more. And I had a wonderful relationship with Nora, and I was privileged to be invited by the Society to speak at the official opening of the Nora Peak Research Room in Thurning Villa.
Tell me a bit about Nora. For those of us that don't know Nora well, where did she get her interest in heritage or history, do you think?
From being a salesperson in the ladies' department of David Jones. How she did it, I don't know, but that was her calling in life. She worked there for years, but she did an archaeology diploma at Sydney University in adult life, and she just had a passion for wanting to know every movement of every house or block of land she had any connection with. So if she was doing a study on the old Ashfield Park estate, she did a title search on every block of land on the Ashfield Park estate, which is basically from Ashfield Park up to Croydon. And she knew the history of every block of land. When we came to do the book on Summerhill many years ago, Nora had not done a great deal on blocks on Summerhill, so she had to go out and go to the land titles office. She'd retired from DJs by then, and so she was off to the land titles office every day. I suppose she was in her 70s. She was great, just amazing worker. Wonderful research assistant.
So you mentioned the Summerhill publication.
That's it. That'd be the second impression, probably.
Okay. Edited by Chris Pratten, came out in 1999.
Yes.
And one thing I've been most impressed by your writing is you don't shy away from controversy. In fact, the name Summerhill, you've discovered.
I've smashed
the myth about the so-called term sunning hill.
That's correct.
And you've been bold enough to say, and I quote here, George Watson, who you've attributed to being perhaps the author of that term sunning hill in its context with Summerhill, and you've said he clearly got it wrong with this particular story. So not only are you not shying away from controversy, perhaps you're even promoting a bit of controversy by dispelling what was possibly, could even be erroneously, but common knowledge.
Well, George Watson was one of the greatest contributors to Ashfield's public good because he was the proprietor of the Ashfield newspaper, The Advertiser, which started in about 1885 and George sold it, I think, in 1911, and between 1885 and 1911, every year he gave a bound volume of the newspaper to the local council, and Mitchell Library was able to make fiche out of those papers years ago. So we've got every Ashfield advertiser from 1885 to 1911 to study, and it kept going after 1911, but the new owner, George Watson's offsider, a fellow by the name of Green, didn't keep the practice going of giving the council a bound volume.
But what I was really interested in, that you're not shying away from controversial topics, and you've even mentioned that someone...
Yeah, but I say that, and I'm actually a great supporter of George Watson.
Sure.
So that was a long way of getting around to saying that if I say it about someone who I respect, it means I'm absolutely certain. That's what I was getting
So you're
at.
absolutely certain of the facts?
I'm absolutely certain that there was no Summerhill racecourse, because I've looked at the newspapers and the train stopping adjacent to Ashfield Racecourse. And the horse races were at Ashfield, and there's no mention of Summerhill Racecourse. So,
how do you know that your research is 100% complete?
because I did it.
Okay.
Well, not 100, can't be 100% complete, but that I did is 100% accurate. He's obviously not convinced here.
So your accuracy, your research determination, your accuracy, perhaps even supported by Nora, gives you such the confidence that you can say that someone else is wrong.
Yes. You've got to be able to do that, otherwise we don't advance.
Last month, your major publication on your grandfather, H.E. Pratten, was released. What was it like to finish that major piece of work?
Oh, great relief, because it was dragging on. I'd started back in, again, when I still lived at Orange, before I'd come to Sydney to work. And done a bit here and a bit there, and then I got the job at the National Trust, and I didn't have the time to do that much, but I learnt so much more about looking at old papers at the Mitchell Library and that sort of thing. So then I did more, and then I got ill for 10 or 15 years, and then I determined, when I felt better back in 2014, I determined to finish it. And in 2016, it was finished.
Yeah, congratulations. What aspect of the research interested you the most?
Oh, all of it, really. I said to Carol Liston, who wrote a foreword for the book and then eventually launched it, I said to her that I was very worried that I felt sections of it were totally inadequate, and I knew that I could have written a lot more. And she said, "Oh, don't worry about that. Everyone that writes a thing like a biography feels that way about it." So when she said that, I thought, well, let's finish it, because there are a lot of sections, and I'm probably the only person at this stage that knows that there's a lot more material there. Whether anyone will ever do any more on it is a moot point. My eldest son used to be interested, but I don't know whether he's got the time or the ability, and he's ageing, he's 55.
So what is it about your grandfather that has motivated you?
I don't know. I was only thinking of this a few days ago, actually. I don't know what started me on my grandfather. I guess it was as a child playing in his house after his death. I never knew him because he died in 1928 and I didn't arrive till 1934. But I used to play in the big house and I used to look at the books on his shelves, and when the library was finally dispersed in 1960, I made sure that I got hold of a lot of those books, the historical records of Australia and the illustrated history of World War One and things like that. They're now in my library upstairs. And so I guess that contact with his old library, which didn't contain many books of great moment, that must have been what interested me many years ago. And then once I'd started, I just visited Bristol when I went to England on a couple of trips in the 1980s and 1990s, and saw the house in which he lived and the shop that his father had, and the streets of this suburb of Bristol called Fish Ponds were just like the streets in the inner west, two-storey walk-up buildings, no high-rise at all, and that grabbed my interest. The trams used to run up there as they did in Ashfield, and that all gelled. And the ultimate result was that I finished the book. Mm. But he was a very ambitious man. I'm not that ambitious. I'm too lazy, laid back. But he was clearly very ambitious and started things, and often it was his half-brother that took them over, such as the printing works and the tin mining. And so he was an initiator of things, and that gelled with me, clearly.
And my observation may be that you share a tenacity for a cause.
Yes, his tenacity was more... he shared a tenacity for protection of Australian industry right from when he was a teenager. He used to make speeches when he came to Australia at the age of 20. He made speeches around Ashfield and Canterbury on protection. And that's pretty unusual. You don't find 20-year-olds speaking about protection for Australian industry or anything else these days, except boys speaking about girls and girls speaking about boys on Facebook or something, whatever that is.
Do you have any advice to young people in becoming interested, or how might they become interested in history, local history and heritage?
No, that's where we've fallen down, and it's where our present president, John Ward, has always spoken of the need to do things with school kids and that sort of thing, but it's easy to speak about it. It's more difficult to know precisely what to do. One of the disappointments over the years, keeping our Historical Society rooms open so much has been the dearth of people that have come. And usually when school kids have come, they've really expected almost that we should do something for them. They lacked the stimulus that an older person has to go and start ferreting things out yourself. How you solve that gulf, I don't know.
Well, clearly, Chris, you've brought a lot of heritage and history understanding in the local Ashfield area. What would you like to be remembered for future generations here?
I am not going to write my epitaph for you, Mark. It's very vain to say so, but there are three publications that I was very proud to have my name on the cover. The first was our book on brickmaking, Working the Clays. Mm-hmm. Nora did a lot of the title search in that, and I think that was a good book, and I'm so sad that it didn't top the sales in the inner west. In fact, there are still copies available, I think. And then came Summerhill, and we've mentioned that. And then the third of that three publications that I have my name on the cover was Ashfield at Federation. Now that was so big, it wouldn't fit in a kid's backpack now. But it's full of stuff. Good stuff, and it features a lot of articles by Anne O'Connell on women's affairs, feminist sort of stuff a man would say today, but that was good. That was good, and it brought a new author. That was where Anne cut her teeth, and she's done so much since then. So that was the three books that I was pleased to have my name associated with.
Well, Chris, it's been great participating in this interview with you. Thank you for sharing your time and your remembrances with us. Thank you very much for all of the work that you've done contributing to Ashfield. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure.